Assalamu alaikum, brothers, sisters, and friends. Welcome to a new episode of the GDM show, the Global Dawah Movement show. On this week's show, we're going to be discussing something very, very, very interesting. And we're back with Brother Sabur firstly. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Sabur. How are you?
Good.
Okay. So 2 weeks ago, we discussed something very interesting. And the title of the show was Richard Dawkins, or How Richard Dawkins Supports iERA's Narrative.
Yeah, that was an interesting
It's a spicy title, and with a lot of spicy content as well.
Annoyed a lot of people.
Yeah.
So.
Anyway, but there's a very interesting point in there that we made, which was regarding evolution. We touched upon evolution, and the point we were generally making was there are facts in science, and then there are facts in reality. And scientific facts aren't necessarily absolute facts, right? Yeah. And we mentioned this, and we clarified this, that when we say something's a scientific fact, what we're saying is that it's not necessarily absolutely true, because science, the method itself, is based on things like induction. And induction in itself, which is one, if you like, limiting factor of science, results to you not having absolute truth from the method itself.
Yeah, the problem of induction, the black swan problem.
Yeah, exactly. So, which is basically that you're always limited to your observations, and then you make your conclusions based on those observations. It's always possible that there'll be future observations which basically throw over your theory.
Yeah, and the history of science is full of these paradigms.
Yeah.
You know, we've discovered it. There's nothing new to be discovered in physics, as Kelvin, the physicist, said. And then they had the quantum and the Einsteinian revolution.
Let's not get too technical. Let's keep it simple. But anyway, the point is,
you have paradigm shifts. Science changes all the time.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Thing is, on one hand, I feel encouraged by the fact that even you guys appear to be learning that the whole evolution is just a theory shtick, doesn't work anymore. But on the other hand, I feel you've somewhat missed what a theory is by the intricacies. A scientific theory is less a singular fact in itself, but more an explanation of the facts which have stood the academic scrutiny applied in science. It is the well-substantiated interpretation of other facts, i.e., in this instance, that all known life shares a common ancestor, and that there is a great biodiversity in existence today. Now, this is a horribly simplified version, but from these two facts we make a hypothesis which explains said facts in relation to one another, and if they stand the trial of academic scrutiny, we acknowledge them as scientific theories.
Now, what we're going to touch upon today is, if you like, a small niche in what we were discussing last time, and it's going to be very interesting because it's, again, regarding evolution. Now, understanding what scientific fact is and what a real fact is, evolution, if you like, is considered to be a scientific fact, a strong scientific fact, a scientific theory, right? Which are basically, like you mentioned before, they're both synonymous terms, and they're pretty much the same thing.
In scientific discourse, they're synonymous.
Synonymous. Okay. So now what I want to discuss today is a very specific point, and that is there agreement amongst the experts in the field of evolution, amongst the scientific community, regarding the theory of evolution?
Okay, that's a good question. What I would say is we first need to define what we mean by evolution, because the way you define it in some ways is very scientifically sound, other ways not so. So if you mean variation in species, scientists wouldn't really disagree with that. If you mean natural selection taking place, again, most scientists wouldn't really disagree with that. They would say yes.
So majority of the cases, there will be consensus amongst the regarding.
Yeah, they'll say no. I mean, when it comes to, for example, the variation of butterflies, I mean, that's something that scientists have actually seen in the lab.
Yeah.
So they'll say, we don't have an issue
with this. There's an interesting
image
image that you showed me earlier, or maybe we could share with the viewers.
Yes.
The scientist thinking of a butterfly, and he's saying evolution is a fact based on what he's thinking of, and then the child who's listening to this, he has a totally different concept in his mind.
Exactly.
No, they are the exact same thing, but one exists in a broader understanding. The scientist only has so much time to observe so much variation. Therefore, their research is specifically carried out in investigating the mechanism of natural variation and environmental selection. This mechanism acts to give us an understanding of the process of evolution and how we have come from a common ancestor. On screen is a rough example of what the scientist sees specifically in their lab, and the larger picture is what that all feeds into. Now we have separate evidence for common ancestry, namely being that of genetics in modern science, as we are able to plot what we term a phylogenetic tree of life, which works in a similar fashion as paternity tests, merely on a bigger scale. Since Imran is here and he is a big fan of using cake in analogies, these facts, i.e. the fact of common ancestry as shown through genetics and the fossil record, the fact of biodiversity today, and the fact of the mechanism observed in the laboratory, all act as factual ingredients that are baked to make the cake of evolutionary theory. Now, you may believe it is only a half-baked cake, but you will be hard-pressed to display that. The only people who make this distinction between the two are creationists and the pseudoscientific community. I would love you to find an evolutionary scientist or any person who actually understands the field making said claim. I really would. So get your information straight before you do a video on evolution. It is rather simple.
So it can actually create confusion because the third aspect or third definition of evolution is a universal common ancestor. All of life can be explained by natural selection and mutations. And this is actually not scientifically as strong of a theory as variation or natural selection on its own.
No. These are facts on their own, which evolution then seeks to explain. This is not what evolution itself claims. Okay, can we just get that straight? It does not claim that we share a common ancestor. It is the bridge between that already established fact and the fact of our current biodiversity. The mechanism acts as the suspension or the pillars which hold up the bridge and allow it to exist. How do you not get this from your supposed research into the field? It really does surprise me. If you understand evolution, you would not be making these mistakes.
Okay, so let me get this right. You're saying there's three aspects,
Three meanings
to evolution, or the
Right.
theory of evolution. And what you're saying is the first two, as we discussed, they're fine. There's a general
Scientifically, you wouldn't find, I haven't found a scientist that disagrees
but
with
it's the
that.
third meaning which there's problems in, which is that everything on Earth has evolved via a common ancestor, and it all goes back to a single cell which it all originated from. The tree of life,
so basically, the tree of life,
okay.
all of that. Yeah.
via the process of natural selection.
There is only one definition of the theory of evolution in biological sciences. This dissection is fallacious and only occurs inside circles ignorant of what evolution discusses and what a scientific theory is. You are practically saying that you accept the mechanism and accept its abilities, but deny the conclusion formed from these and the rest of the evidence which overwhelmingly is in support of evolution. I have observed erosion and deposition forming a miniature delta. When I was camping in Norway, on the first night it started tipping down with rain. Once the lag period was up and the soil was too drenched to soak up any more water, we ended up with a beck, a small stream, flowing past our campsite on the beach, and it happened around lunchtime. This picked up sand, mud, and the peat from the surrounding soil and deposited it at the lakeside, creating this miniature delta which built up like a foot and, onto the water. That is erosion and deposition. I can witness that in real time. What I cannot witness is the construction of a full-sized river delta, such as the Ganges Delta, which spans 220 miles across. Now, I know the delta was not always there due to soil composition, and I've seen a mechanism which can create said delta, and of course, said delta is there today. They are the exact same thing, but one is simply on a larger scale and time frame than the other. The same goes for this really focused aspect of evolution and how it can be, expanded to explain the general theory as a whole. Do you understand that now?
So sometimes when you have in school saying, look, the teacher says evolution is a fact, I've seen it in my lab, the child might think, okay, that means the tree of life is an absolute fact.
Right, okay, now, for now, I'm sure the people watching, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, they're probably thinking, this guy with a pretty nice beard is making a bold claim, right?
Thank you very much.
He's making a bold claim. He's saying that scientists, evolutionary scientists, are disagreeing with each other. The experts in the field don't really agree with each other regarding this aspect of the theory. Have you any evidence to back that up? Are there any individuals you can cite us?
Okay, I can, and just before that, I just want to give a small caveat, which is I'm not going to quote any scientist who's a creationalist, who's an intelligent design scientist, because, somebody would say, oh, you're just taking so-and-so's work and you're just citing it.
Yeah.
I'm going to mention people who are authorities in their field, and they don't have some sort of religious agenda behind what they're saying.
So, okay, just to knock off the contention that these guys are quoting religious theist individuals who make these claims. So every person that we're going to hear from you about is either an atheist or a naturalist.
You'll see yourself. They're authorities in science,
right?
And
that's the main crux.
Yeah.
They're the authorities in science, and they don't have any religious dogma or backing or anything like that.
So they don't have that sort of incentive.
Okay, so good.
Now, firstly, when it comes to the third meaning of evolution, which is universal common ancestor, this is something that there's always been some sort of dispute amongst academics, right? So this goes back all the way to Darwin. In the early 1990s, this was something that was being discussed a bit more frequently. Then this kept building up till, I would say, about 2008, 2009, around this time. It started then filtering, started going a bit further. In like, I'll give you an example, like the New Scientist magazine, which is a popular magazine, it's not a scientific journal. They had a headline in 2009, Darwin was wrong. And what they were doing was they were basically explaining about the scientists that disagree with Darwinism. So I just want to read a quote here. This is from the magazine. For a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life, says Eric Baptiste, an evolutionary biologist at the Pierre and Marie Curie University in Paris, France. A few years ago, it looked as though the Grail was within reach. But today the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. Many biologists now argue that the tree concept is obsolete and needs to be discarded. We have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. And again, within the same article, the atheist philosopher of biology, John Dupree, he says, if there is a tree of life, it is a small structure growing out of the web of life. So you can see within this article, I know it's a magazine, but the authorities that are within that article are major authorities. They're not, nobody.
So none of these people are religious people or theists?
Yeah, they're not. They don't have a religious motivation. With John Dupree, he's an atheist. And what you'll find is, as soon as you try and challenge Darwinian evolution, the first thing is, oh, you're creationist, oh, you're religious. So that's why we're very careful in this show to cite people who don't have a religious background.
Right, okay.
Well, first of all, science has no authorities beyond a person making an evidence-based argument. The moment their argument lacks evidence, their argument is invalid, regardless of their qualifications. Qualifications are merely a sign of what a person can achieve, not necessarily of what they have achieved with that argument. Secondly, you've quote mined. The article doesn't even touch the general theory of evolution. I mean, you've wanted to display through this that the idea of common ancestry was in question. However, all these quotes led into was discussion on how certain organisms are able to pass DNA to other organisms without procreation. The tree of life as an analogy to describe the Animalia kingdom is rather sound with a few exceptions, along with most plants, fungi and protista. There is some hybridization that can occur between entirely separate branches, but the main issue here is with archaea and bacteria. You see, many single-celled organisms can pass and absorb information that exists in the environment. This can be done through consuming a smaller single-celled organism. Now, if this larger cell is from one stemmed branch of the evolutionary tree, and the smaller cell from another, you end up with webbing going between the branches as the large cell absorbs the smaller one and its information with it. They did not argue against the common ancestor, but rather that the base of the tree of life is less branch-like and more, well, like a tangle of roots or a web based around a common ancestor based in the center. So, for you to actively select a part that only agrees with you if utilized disingenuously when removed from its total context is deeply dishonest, and yet I've shown time and time again that the preachers from iERA, i.e. the Islamic Education and Research Academy, do not care at all about what the original sources actually say. All they care about is how can they lie to make their believers follow on to what they're saying all the more. It really is disheartening.
So another question then, if that's clear, someone may have is, well, there's only a few people that disagree with the theory. Generally, there's a consensus regarding this point.
When it comes to the third meaning of evolution, I would say actually there's a lot of disagreement, and disagreement is now starting to come out of the scientific journals and is now creeping into Amazon and books, popular books that the public can access. So I just want to recommend 3 titles which I think are quite interesting. So you have Darwinian Fairy Tales by, again, the atheist philosopher Richard Stove, and he basically tackles it from a sociological point of view, that it doesn't actually make sense. Now, what Darwin got wrong, this is by, again, an atheist philosopher, James Fodor, and the cognitive scientist, Massimo Patimi Palmari.
Hopefully you got that right.
Hopefully I got that right. Then you have the biologist James Shapiro's book, Evolution, A View from the 21st Century. Again, he doesn't have a religious motivation. He actually speaks out against creationism.
Right. Okay.
So these people are people who are quite well known within their fields.
Yep.
And for someone to come in and say, oh, that's just some few fringe scientists here and there, I would say, no, actually, this is now gaining almost a critical mass.
Okay.
Non-peer-reviewed books are not where science ends up as it gains evidence. Where it ends up as it gains evidence are peer-reviewed journal articles. But, David Stove was an Australian philosopher who critiqued not the biological theory of evolution as you seem to pretend here, but the sociological application, i.e. social Darwinism, which, by the way, Darwin himself and most secularists stand completely against, so it's really irrelevant. This whole understanding of the facts that, yes, evolution exists in nature, but what exists in nature is not necessarily what we should do in society. That's actually called the naturalistic fallacy. So that's why it was attacking that, and it doesn't deal at all with what we're discussing here, so why do you bring it up? Then with Jerry Fodor, another philosopher, and Massimo, i.e. the cognitive scientist, on their book What Darwin Got Wrong, well, they're pretty sloppy, particularly the notorious chapter 6, which goes over the problem of selection 4, which seems to suggest that the natural selection isn't a process that occurs via certain members of the population being able to survive, but nature actively selecting specific traits. Just try wrapping your head around what these people thought natural selection was to make such a fallacious argument. And then James Shapiro just confuses me as a person because he himself just seems to be a total mess in his work. But the fact is that these people are still very fringe. There are countless evolutionary biologists, and here you have not a single one who was an evolutionary biologist, just scientists from random fields all over, and you seem to think, oh, this isn't fringe just because you say it isn't. That's not how it works. And they are certainly fringe in the fact that they are writing in non-peer-reviewed journals when they know if they have evidence to counter Darwinism, then they would actually put it in scientific journal articles rather than try targeting the ignorant layman as they are doing here, and you're building into that and attempting to do the exact same. If they don't have the science to back themselves up, their opinions are worthless regardless of the qualifications they have to their name. Qualifications are a sign of ability, not the sign of how good their specific argument is.
It's very interesting. Now, there's a very interesting clip regarding this as well that you wanted to share.
I'm not so sanguine as some of my colleagues here that there's only one life form on this planet. We have a lot of different types of metabolism, different organisms. I wouldn't call you the same life form as the one we have that lives in pH 12 base that would dissolve your skin if we dropped you in it.
Oh, I've got the same genetic code. We'll have a common ancestor.
Well, you don't have the same genetic code. In fact, the mycoplasmas use a different genetic code and would not work in your cells. So there are a lot of variations on the
But you're not saying it belongs to a different tree of life from me, are you?
Well, I think the tree of life is an artifact of some early scientific studies that aren't really holding up. So the tree, there may be a bush of life.
Right. Yes.
Bush.
I don't like that word.
But that's only in.
All right, I concede that point. Yeah.
So there is not a tree of life, and in fact,
You, in fact, had a comment you wanted to make, Richard, I think.
Well, it's rather moved on. I mean, I was just going to say I can't imagine why anyone should think it was an ethical problem. I could see why they might think it was a problem of expediency. You might fear that it would, escape and overrun the world or something. But ethical problem, I can't see.
Well,
but I'm now intrigued by Craig saying that he. I'm intrigued at Craig saying that the Tree of Life is a fiction. I mean, the DNA code of all creatures that have ever been looked at is all but identical, and surely that means that they're all related, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So that was very, very interesting. You had a panel discussion. I believe that was Richard Dawkins. You had obviously Krauss there, which wasn't doing much in this clip. Nevertheless, you had Richard Dawkins. You had
Dr. Craig Venter.
Dr. Craig Venter. Now he had some very interesting points that he's just made.
I mean, he's speaking about the web of life, and what's quite interesting is somebody can come in again and say, "Oh, he's just a creationist." Yeah. Actually, he's not. He is an anti-theist. He is irreligious, he's an atheist, he believes he can create a life in a lab, and, so again, he doesn't have a religious motivation to disagree with the tree of life. Yeah. But what's interesting is Dawkins is out of touch.
Yeah, he seemed like in the clip, because he seems to be trying to tell Dr. Venter, he's like, oh, I thought it was this, isn't this true? It's almost like he's trying to get acknowledgement from him.
Wait, so you knew about the web of life, i.e. a slight alteration of the tree of life that has our common ancestor in the middle, with some slight interspecial RNA and DNA transmission early on that slows down considerably as we move further and further into large multicellular life forms, and yet you pretended the article earlier disagreed with common ancestry altogether. The tree of life is not evolution, and neither is, common ancestry. Common ancestry is only a little bit, and it is certainly vital, but that's a fact that is completely verified on its own without evolution. Evolution seeks to explain that already verified fact. But again, tree of life is not evolution. I don't understand how you've really equated the two. the tree of life is called an analogy. It's not actuality. Now that analogy may not be exact when you focus on a specific segment, e.g. it may in fact turn out to be faulty as an analogy when you focus on one specific aspect, and therefore people can suggest ways to improve said analogy, because an analogy is merely a simplified way to explain a complicated subject to someone who doesn't quite understand it yet. I believe in giving the tree of life roots and having some branches that do converge later on. But to call the scientific understanding of modern biology into question because of this slight error in an analogy, which isn't the actual scientific theory in itself, merely a way to explain it, is a fallacy based upon analogy. There may also be some single-celled organisms in the deep which evolved independently of the tree of life which we originate from, the one that we can track back to our ocean nursery, as was noted in the hypothesized possibility in the clip removed from the video utilized. That is why Richard Dawkins wanted to clarify this point, but sadly got no response before the questions moved on. There's nothing here to disagree with our common ancestor and with the Animalia kingdom, so it's more than irrelevant. It's a red herring, it's just junk. So what on earth are you doing bringing it up as supposed evidence against evolution? It makes no sense.
It's quite interesting because even recently, just about 2-3 years ago, the evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson and Richard Dawkins, they had a disagreement on kin selection. Now, they were going back and forth on Twitter and, on Prospect magazine. Richard Dawkins was writing a review of his book, The Social Conquest of Earth, and they were just going back and forth. And then E.O. Wilson came on BBC Newsnight and he said something quite interesting. He said, look, there's no disagreement between me and Richard Dawkins because I'm a scientist and he's a journalist.
I know you've had quite a big history with Richard Dawkins and a different view of the natural selection process. Where are we on that now, in your view?
There is no dispute between me and Richard Dawkins, and never has been, because he's a journalist. And journalists are people who report what the scientists have found. And the arguments I've had have actually been with scientists doing research.
Yeah. And Richard Dawkins found that quite offensive, but he is sort of right, because Richard Dawkins for the last 20 years, he's been writing science books, speaking about theology, speaking about philosophy, not well, as we know. And so he's been sort of out of touch with what's actually been happening in evolutionary biology. And interestingly, the person who most people regard as an authority in evolutionary biology isn't really respected by people within the field.
Right, okay, so I think that sums up the core points there. I'm just keep thinking about Richard Dawkins, and it's almost like a little puppy looking over and saying, oh, is this right? Am I still correct? Like 20 years later.
When all else fails, character assassination is the way to go. You are a pretentious couple of pricks. Yes, Richard Dawkins is more engaged with the media, but that doesn't mean he is no longer involved with science. Now, E.O. Wilson's comment was completely unprofessional, and likewise, some of Dawkins' actions are the same. So what? Human beings have pride and make mistakes, and this can sometimes all come out negatively. So what? Now, E.O. Wilson does not agree with you, and him taking a unprofessional jab at Dawkins, and then you giggling about it like a pair of tits as if it's an actual point, when it's just really redundant. You've not brought forward any argument that's stood here in the discussion, and we're really discussing about the intricacies of evolution in this video, which does not refute the overall theory's validity. So I really don't see what you're attempting in this video. Sure, the finer points are still in discussion. So what?
But nevertheless, I think the points are made very clear, that there is disagreement amongst the experts. All the sources you quoted were all non-religious, non-theist.
Many atheists, many anti-theists.
Experts in the field.
Yeah.
So I think this is very good, because I don't think this has been mentioned before or pointed out that, it's been presented as this, and that's what I'm going to ask you now. But in actual fact, what's happening behind closed doors is that there's a lot of hair being pulled and, screaming going on and all these things.
Scientific review is review. The fact that evolution is being challenged internally all the time speaks to the theory's ability to survive. You don't think something is good quality before you have tested it. You think that when you've seen it being tested repeatedly and it still stands up to conditions which another product would not be able to stand up to. Had someone found evidence in all this argumentation to discredit evolution, all you have shown is that they would not hesitate, they would not hide it, they would reveal it in an instant and bring down the entire field on the top of their peers to enact a paradigm shift. What you mock is science's strength in being critical of everyone, including itself and its peers. So, what are you going on about?
Understanding this, last question before we wrap it up. Why do we find that the theory of, or at least Darwinian evolution, is still being presented to the public, the mainstream, as, if you like, a fact, a scientific fact? Textbooks, school textbooks, and so on and so forth. If this is the reality, this is what's going on.
We need to take two things into consideration. One is history. Whenever a prevailing theory, a paradigm, it goes through a period of normal science, so it's being accepted by everyone, and it's termed a fact. Now, when academics realize, actually, no, we have to change this now, there's a slow process between when the academics change their minds and when the school children, little Timmy, sees actually it's a web of life, it's not a tree of life.
Right.
So there's that transition which takes a bit of time. But also there's something interesting James Chappro says in his book, A View from the 21st Century. Given the status of biological evolution, we can anticipate that a paradigm shift in our understanding of the subject will have repercussions far outside the life sciences. So you see, Imran, it's not just historically it takes a long time for a paradigm shift to trickle down to the layman. There's a lot more at stake if Darwinian evolution is not true.
Well, and I'm sure that lot more at stake we can discuss in future episodes. But anyway, Jazakallah khair for coming on. Thank you. And Jazakallah khair, brothers, sisters, friends, for watching. And we hope to see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.
The reason it is still alive as a scientific theory is that it has yet to be discredited. All examples you used either disagreed with you entirely or were simply ignorant to what the theory of evolution was. That is not the basis to enact a paradigm shift. The level of dishonesty you have displayed throughout this video is outstanding. I would truly be in awe did I not already know you guys. You have picked, mined, and dug your way through mountains of discourse to find the little bits of shite that, if given in a bad light, make your position look golden, when really it's a lump of coprolite. Why couldn't you just be honest and note that the theory of evolution is accepted by a staggering evidence-based consensus, excluding a few small details that are hotly discussed and contended to ensure we find the truth as soon as possible? See, that's what happens when I actually talk about what's going on. It doesn't sound so good for you, does it? You need to either read up on your science or simply leave the conversation, as your abilities have been weighed and have been found to be entirely wanting, and your dishonesty is just off the charts. So really, you have no ability to talk about this topic.